you ever wondered if the stretching that you're doing as part of your self-care is actually making a difference or helping you, especially if you've adopted some of the gentle stretching techniques that I've talked about in some of my other videos? Today, I have a really simple thing to add into your stretching routine that will take you an additional 10 to 20 seconds max and will prove to you whether or not your stretching is making a difference. So hi, welcome back if you've watched before. Welcome if you're new. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Katherine. I'm the founder and principal therapist of LSM Clinic, a sport and remedial massage therapy clinic in East London. And in this channel, I share information about how the body works and ways that you can take care of yourself and ways that we can help you to enjoy your favorite activities and live your life as close to pain-free as possible. We talk a lot about stretching on this channel. I have a stretching playlist that I'll link below if you haven't seen it. And we talk about, the importance of stretching the right muscles and that if you overstretch, it can actually make your muscles tighter. And we've talked about how sometimes really gentle stretching appears to actually be more effective than like the harder, really pushing into it stretching. But ultimately, you want to know that the work that you're doing is having a benefit, right? You don't want to feel like you're doing all of this time and energy trying to fit this in and not know if it makes a difference. Now, I want to share a story of an interaction I had with a client in the gym a number of years ago that demonstrated why this is really important. So I was walking through the gym and I saw this client doing an extremely, how should we put it? Pushy, it was a hard stretch, like really pushing on the quads. So basically what they were doing is they had their back to a wall and they were kneeling on their knees and they had their foot up behind them on the wall and they were leaning all their weight back to stretch the quads. Now, obviously that felt like a strong stretch, right? They could really feel the pull in the muscle, which if you've watched any of my other videos, isn't always an indication that you're really stretching the muscle. And I walked over to him and I was like, oh, what are you doing? Like, we've talked about stretching. That's a really strong stretch. Are you actually, is that actually helping you? And he was like, yeah, I don't really know how to tell if it helps, but I can feel the stretch while I'm doing it. So I think that must mean that it's stretching, right? And I said, okay, let me show you how to test this. And I took him through exactly what I've told you, which is lifting the knee. So what we did is we took the leg that he hadn't stretched yet, because he'd only done the right leg, and did the left leg, where he lifted his knee behind him. And then he did my gentle quad stretch, which doesn't take the knee past 90 degrees, but is very effective. And then he tested the movement again, and he was really surprised at how different his leg felt. It was like 30 to 50% better. And then I had him test his leg and ask him if it felt any different compared to before he did the stretch. And he was like, I don't think so. I don't know. I didn't really test it. And then I had him stretch the way that he had been stretching. That I stopped him because he hadn't been stretching very long when I stopped him for the same amount of time. And then he retested his right leg and he felt no difference. In fact, his knee felt a little bit achy after he retested. And that's the other reason why this is really helpful, because a lot of times we have this idea that the only way a stretch is effective is if we're really feeling a stretch while it's happening, and that if we don't feel a stretch while it's happening, it's not helping us. But if you know about overstretching, when you push really hard into a stretch, it really often can make the tissue tighter, not just the muscles, but sometimes also the fascia. So that's why today I wanted to share with you something that I've been working with my clients on for probably the last couple of years, when I started to realize that this could help them too. And that is testing before and after you stretch. Now, in clinic, if you've ever been to one of our appointments, you know that we do a lot of testing, and we will work on a couple of muscles and then we will retest to see what difference it made. Did it make it worse? Did it make it better? How much of a difference did it make? And etc. But then I realized, why aren't I telling clients to do this on their own? We know that testing shows us the difference that something makes. Why wouldn't we say to clients, hey, when you're at home doing your self-care, you should be testing too, especially after the releases. It's a little bit harder to stretch after activations. I'm going to share with you what this looks like how to test, how to incorporate it. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of different muscles so you can see how to put it into practice. Then if you have any other questions or anything like that, you can always leave a comment below, but hopefully that will help you start to incorporate it into your day-to-day. So basically the way that you test before and after a stretch is immediately before you do a stretch, you do a movement that tests how tight that muscle is. And then after you do that movement again, and you want to look for, does it feel lighter, easier? Do you feel stronger? Does it feel more flexible? Noticing the difference before and after. Now, this is especially important after you do the more gentle stretching that we recommend, because like we've said in those videos, you may not feel a huge stretch while you're doing it, but those can actually be the ones that give you the most benefit. So testing in this way allows you to get that benefit. So first of all, to test, you basically want to do a movement that shows you how tight the muscle is. And this can be one of two ways. So I'll give you an example with the quads. So the quads are a group of 4 muscles across the front of the thigh. They attach right under the knee, right under the kneecap on the tibia. And 3 of the muscles attached to the thigh and 1 of them cross over the hip. Anything where you're bending your knee will put a stretch, even if it's a small one, on your quads. So the way that you could test if a quad stretch that you're doing makes a difference is when you're standing upright, let's say this is the knee and this is the thigh and this is the lower leg, you could simply just bend your leg like this. And that's going to test how flexible your quad is. Then you can do your quad stretch and do that again and see what kind of difference it makes. Another way that you can test for before and after you do a stretch is using that muscle. Now, I know that seems counterintuitive, but one of the things that we find is that when a muscle is really tight, it can actually affect the muscle's ability to contract or do its job. We'll actually see that some people have less power in a muscle when it's chronically tight than when it's loose. Obviously not when it's too loose, but that's a discussion for another day. So I'll give you an example of how you could use the muscle as a test. So in this case, we have a knee lift for the hip flexor. So the hip flexor attaches from the front of the spine, of your lower spine, into the inside of your thigh bone, the lesser trochanter. So that means that when you lift your knee, you are using that hip flexor. Now, ideally, if you stretch your hip flexor, and a hip flexor stretch can be something like a lunge or a lunge type position, but you're not doing quads, you're relaxing the hip flexor. There's also a standing hip flexor stretch you can do where you have one leg behind and just push your hips forward, which I talk a little bit about why does my lower back hurt after I stand or walk for a long time, which I will also link in the description of this video. So you would lift the knee and see how heavy your knee feels. See how hard or easy it feels to lift that knee. You would do your hip flexor stretch, and then you'd lift your knee again. And ideally, it should feel lighter. Sometimes if the piriformis is tight, you may not notice a huge difference. So if having tight piriformis or chronically tight piriformis is something that you know you have, that might not work. So the other way that you could do it is the same as the quad. You could stretch that muscle. You could bring your leg behind you, which would give you a pull on the hip flexor. Now, how do you know if you're stretching a muscle? Now, hopefully, if you're stretching the muscle, you already know how to stretch it, right? If you're already doing stretches. But basically, you want to know where the 2 ends of the muscle are, and you want to make the distance between them longer, which is why when you bend your knee, you're making the distance longer than when it's short, which is why when you bring your leg behind you and you keep your back or your torso where it is, then you're stretching the hip flexor because you're bringing those 2 points away from each other. So another example of a test that you can do before and after stretch is for the chest. So as you probably know, if you've watched our videos before, one of the big drivers of neck and shoulder pain is that our pecs can be really tight, and that can be pec major and pec minor. Now, they do attach in slightly different places, but they both will have the effect of pulling the shoulder forward and down when they are tight. So the stretch for that is something like this, right? Opening the arm, doing the cactus stretch, doing the door frame stretch. So a good way to test that is to raise your arm up and over the head and bring it back down and see how heavy your arm feels, see if you feel any pinching anywhere, if it feels clunky, if it feels like heavy, or if you can't get past a certain point. And then you would stretch, doorway stretch or the cactus stretch, and retest. And then you would see, does my arm feel lighter? Does my shoulder feel smoother in the movement? Does it feel easier to do the movement? Has the pain that I had before or the ache changed? So when you do that, you would retest and you see if it makes a difference. And you can do the same for the lats as well. So the lats are another muscle that are very heavily involved with neck and shoulder pain. And so you would raise the arm again because you're making more distance between the front of the shoulder where the lats attach and kind of the side back area. So just to recap, the way that you would test to make sure that your stretch is easier is by finding the distance between the 2 points and making it greater, or using the muscle to see if it feels stronger or lighter or easier after you stretch. So by bringing this technique of testing before and after you stretch, you'll see what changes you're actually getting in your body straight away. You'll know whether or not you're getting a benefit. You'll know whether or not you're wasting your time, and you'll avoid making your muscles tighter accidentally because you're overstretching. Because honestly, sometimes the tighter our muscles are, the more gentle of a stretch they need. I would love to know if you try this. Let me know how it goes. Let me know what muscles you're testing. If you're not sure how to test a muscle that you're stretching, leave a comment below and I'll answer it for you. And if you found this video helpful, please like it so more people will see it. Share it with somebody you know who could maybe use some help with their stretching. And subscribe and you'll be notified as we release more videos. So thanks so much for taking the time for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.